Hello, I'm Robin Stamper, the Artistic Director of Straz Center's Opera Tampa, and I'm delighted to be here with two very special guests, Melissa Meisner and Tom Sivak, to discuss our 30th anniversary, our anniversary season of the Supernatural. In this season, we actually have a world premiere and two company premieres. So let's get to business. It's so amazing to have the composer of the very first opera that we're producing, Love v. Death, Mr. Tom Sivak.
Thanks, very excited about it.
So actually, my knowledge of your music first began because Opera Tampa used to do these wonderful little productions outside called The Witching Hour. And in crept in our repertoire these interesting pieces written by this gentleman that I had never met before, Mr. Tom Sivak. And they were so wonderful that Melissa, who has even greater familiarity with his music than I do, and I just wanted to see more of that. So it's a double bill. Apparently, Melissa, you have experience with the first of the double bill.
That's correct. Back in 2019, Tom invited me to perform in a preliminary version of our first act of the double bill. And I was just so delighted by it. I was creeped out a little bit by it in the beginning, but once I learned the music and I learned the text, I was absolutely delighted. And the small audience that was there in that basement that night, they seemed to really enjoy it and appreciate it as much as I did. So I said, we have to do this at Opera Tampa. We have to do this. And I asked him, would he expand the work so that we could make a viable show out of it?
It's a double bill.
It is.
And both of the operas are based on true stories.
Yes, it's a two-act opera, each act being a standalone story that tells the story of an actual historical figure, and everything in the opera is historically accurate. And that's why we could perform Act One of it. It stands alone. It's a story to itself. And so originally it was a chamber opera that was 1 hour long. And Melissa encouraged me to find another subject and make a second act, which I did, and here we are.
So which of the stories?
Well, Act One is about a man called Karl von Kosel. He was a Florida resident, lived in Key West, at the first half of the 20th century. He was an X-ray technician at a TB clinic, and there he met Elena Hoyo, 22 years his junior. And when he saw her, he immediately recognized her as the girl that he had dreamed about when he was a young man. In that dream, his aunt escorted a young, beautiful lady to him and said, "This is your wife-to-be." And so when he saw her, he knew they were fated to be together. And so, unfortunately, Elena had TB, and that's a fatal disease back in 1930. And Karl was not a doctor, but he did everything he could to try to extend her life and to cure her of TB. He employed unethical drugs that he concocted himself. He put her on a vibrating system of some sort, and ultimately used electroshock therapy to try to shock the TB out of her. Unfortunately, she died, and that wasn't the end of it for Karl. He loved her so much, he dug her up, and 7 years later, authorities found her in his bed and arrested him.
Okay, so necrophilia wasn't an ongoing fetish of his.
No.
She created this whole necrophilia aspect.
Well, according to Karl, he visited her gravesite and she sang to him from the grave and said, "Dig me up," so he did, as anybody would, right?
Exactly. Well, we laugh, but apparently it's a dark comedy, because I haven't heard anything funny until that moment. Well, what makes it funny?
As unbelievable, here's something that's funny. As unbelievable as that story is, what's even more unbelievable, I have two more unbelievable facts. Number one, the American public stood behind Karl. when it hit the news, and it did hit the news. Newspaper editorials, radio personalities, and the public in general all felt that Carl was just a hopeless romantic who loved her so much that he couldn't be without her. Even his neighbors in Key West contributed to get his bail to release him. So that's number one, more unbelievable fact. Number two is that it's a comedy.
Yeah.
Well, Melissa, you're stage directing this production. What comic elements do you find?
I'm thrilled to be stage directing it. Like I said, I had a little bit of insight to this back in 2019, and what was really charming to me about it was, the story itself was analogous to my own experience with the work, in that I was so creeped out by the story, I thought, oh gosh, is this going to be okay to participate in? And then I was so delighted by the music and by the comedy, the comic writing of it, that it reminded me of basically the citizens of Key West and the public, right? The public at large loved Carl. I mean, even her parents wouldn't sign the complaint against him because he was so loved by the community and so delighted by him. And so it's like, even though he's this creepy guy that does this creepy thing, we still are delighted by him. And in the same way, I'm delighted by Tom's work, even though it's this creepy subject. Anyway, so I find Tom a very funny person, and so his writing is very funny to me, and just the sheer ridiculousness of the story. He finally cures her, of tuberculosis after her death.
Sounds like he could have started a fad if he was so well liked.
It's very charming. It sounds gross, but it's absolutely charming.
Well, there's a part two, which is about Typhoid Mary. So.
Yes. I thought we should give the audience a little rest after that first story is so horrible, so Typhoid Mary.
How do you sleep at night?
So I think everybody's kind of familiar with the story of Typhoid Mary. That she infected, hundreds of people and killed, who knows how many people. Her name still lives today, as an epithet for someone who's a pariah or, a disaster bringer. And I'd like to describe her in 21st century terms. Mary Mallon was her real name, was the first asymptomatic super spreader known to science. And she never got typhoid fever. She never contracted it. So when they accused her of infecting all these people, I mean, everybody knew back then you caught typhoid fever from somebody who had typhoid fever, and she didn't have it. So how could it be me? You could hardly blame her for that logic. But scientific tests and such did prove that she was linked to at least 100 infections and 6 deaths.
A carrier.
She was a carrier without symptoms, which they did not know was possible in 1905.
She proved it. She proved that it was possible.
After they quarantined her and she was, couldn't escape, they did the test and they found that she was full of bacteria and she was infecting people, whether she wanted to believe it or not.
But also a lot of comic elements, though, once again, in the...
I try to find the humor in any situation, so it's a challenge.
What I find really interesting about this story is that they didn't really discover, correct me if I'm wrong, they didn't discover her, she as a super spreader until wealthy people started dying, right? It was the fact that she was working in wealthy homes and entire families of wealthy people started to die, whereas, with other Irish immigrants that are sort of living in poverty, it wasn't really traced as well. But when the rich people start getting it, then that's when they decide, okay, well, we better look into this and figure out what's going on.
That always works, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so when there was a typhoid outbreak in Oyster Bay, which was a wealthy community where Teddy Roosevelt had a home, and a few doors down was the Warren family, where Mary Mallon was employed as a personal chef. And that's how she infected so many people. She cooked food, and so she's handling this food and giving it to people, and they touched, especially her specialty. Her signature dish was peach cobbler, which is served at room temperature. And they think that's where she got a lot of people, because once the food is cooked, that does kill the bacteria. But once it sits on the shelf and she hands it to you, good luck. So when the Warren family came down with typhoid fever, 6 out of the 11 people who lived there contracted the disease. The authorities perked up, and how did this happen? There's no immigrants nearby. There's no filth. There's no, miasma is what they called it. It was back down in the ghettos, and so they started to research the situation, and they found an immigrant. They found Mary Mellon, who had been the cook there prior to the infections, and so that made sense. She's the one. And Mary always felt she was a scapegoat. She never had typhoid fever. How could it be me? They just want to pin it on an Irish immigrant. They were looked down upon at that time in the United States. And to a certain extent, she's right, because where did the name Typhoid Mary come from? You might be surprised to find out, from the New York Department of Health. In an interview with the New York Times, they were talking about that they found someone who had been spreading it, and out of courtesy, they didn't want to put her name out there. So instead of saying Mary Mellon, they said Typhoid Mary. Well,
Thanks.
unfortunately, that name stuck with her past her death, to this day. There's a quote from her where she says to one of the doctors who was, prosecuting her and putting her in quarantine, she said, "How would you like to be called Dr. Typhoid, Livingston," or whatever his name was? I don't remember. So she was bitter about that name.
Well, you know what? I guess if Sondheim could make a comedy out of slicing people's throats, putting them in a machine that grinds them up into meat pies, why can't we make a comedy out of necrophilia and Typhoid Mary? Actually, as a composer, I have a couple of questions. I used to be friends with Carlisle Floyd, who wrote many, many great American operas, most famously Susanna, and I was asking him about his process. And he, as well as Samuel Barber, their process of writing the music, they sat at the piano, and I know you're a pianist as well. Do you compose at the piano, or do you hear something first and then go to the piano? And how does your process work that way? And the second question is, if I may, with a whole opera, do you start out in your head with the music, a theme, or a single piece that you expand around it? What is your process, Tom?
Well, regarding that, I think that develops. That as I'm writing this or that, I come across something that seems that could be used as a thematic, a motif throughout, and so I will try that out in different places and see, if I can plug it in here and there.
Oh, so you have a peach cobbler motif then?
Well, I don't specifically, but yes, that's the kind of idea. It's more character driven, I think. Like when she's with Alfred, her person she's cohabitating with, there's a certain harmonic palette that I use, and an intervallic thing that I use. Not much was known about Mary Mellon's private life, so it forced me to make a character arc for her, because we don't really care that she was arrested or she did that or did this. It has to come from her heart. We have to feel sorry for her. We have to feel, whether we feel sorry or whatever. You have to make them feel. So since we don't know hardly anything about her other than her business activities and that she infected this guy and she worked here and she worked there, nothing is known. So it allowed me to make a story. And so one of the questions I came up as I was researching her, I was surprised to find that I couldn't find anything about her friends did she ever cook for her friends? There's no McDonald's, there's no takeout. Mm-hmm. If you ate, you cooked it at home, right? And if you had friends over, you cooked for them. Did any of her friends ever contract typhoid fever and die, that is not in the historical record? I think there has to be. It belies belief that it didn't happen, So that's kind of the basis of my story. That does not conflict with the historical record, but fits in around it, I think, in a logical way, and creates an empathy for her as everyone she loves dies. And she doesn't know why, or she refuses to believe why.
But as a composer, do you compose at the piano? Do you find harmonies at the keyboard, or because that's what Carlisle Floyd used to tell me that he.
Well,
and ironically, not ironically, both Floyd and Samuel Barber and Menotti, who was also a pianist, when you see their piano vocal scores, these are reductions of the orchestra parts, all reduced for the piano. They're actually very pianistic, where the composers who didn't do that, they're writing for orchestras. And as a pianist, I sit and play these things. How do you make sense out of that? And because I've played some of your works before, they actually fit rather nicely under their hands.
Yeah, I do sit at a keyboard, not a piano, but I have a keyboard hooked up to my computer, and that's where I write. And I think all those composers, you employ a tonal palette for their music, which I do also. And I went to school in the 1970s, and I was encouraged to write boops and beeps and serial music because that's what people do. You don't write this stuff that's in major or minor.
Interesting.
We do now, though. That's becoming more in fashion. Your music, I don't find your music to be atonal or it's very pleasing and palatable to the untrained ear, as it were.
Well, I think opera is somewhat unapproachable by some people, and I am trying to reach out to them as well as the traditional opera audience by giving them melodies that they can remember, I hope, and harmonies that evoke emotion, sadness, or joy. And I find that music that is lacking those elements, and there is contemporary music that lacks those elements, is difficult for me to participate as a listener.
It doesn't just back to what you were talking about earlier about your process and you having to sort of create more of a storyline for Mary's voice. Likewise, does the other opera, because you had more of Carl's actual words, does that make it easier for you to write the story, right? And that sort of the text, because he wrote he basically wrote a biography of himself, autobiography.
He published what he called a diary in 1950. And he was arrested in 1940. He was released because all the crimes that he committed elapsed by the statute of limitations, so they let him go. In 1950, he published what he called a diary in which he told the entire story. And he was brutally honest about everything and every detail. As horrible as you're reading it, and he's sharing this with the world. So it was really a window into his soul. And, he said it had nothing to do with necrophilia. It didn't. His intentions were pure. He loved her, The public was not wrong, really. He should have done what he did. But he did it all out of love. And when I heard the story, it just screamed opera, Yes. It's love and death, It deals with both, and death wasn't enough to end his love for Helena. It continued.
And does the text that he wrote inform the melodies that you write to accompany those words?
I don't know if directly, if there's a direct link there, but certainly the words, since I also wrote the words, it was, I almost wanted to give him co-writing credit because he wrote very flowerful language. If you read the diary, he's an excellent writer. And I started highlighting different things that he wrote that, would be perfect lyrics. They were so beautifully written. And I was able to do that. So there is a certain percentage of Act One that are actually Carl von Kosel's words. And lawyers, that article is in the public domain, so it's okay that I used it, but it was a luxury to know what the character felt at each moment that he did this or did that.
Yeah.
Whereas Mary Mallon, I had to imagine, she certainly was a bitter and defensive person.
Sure.
And
I heard she chased the doctors out with a cleaver.
Yeah, when they first confronted her. They show up and they go, we'd like to have a blood sample and a fecal sample. She's like, for what? Well, we want to check you for disease. Disease? I'm not sick, And so they wouldn't let go. And so finally she took a meat cleaver and she said, get out. And they left. But they came back, and eventually she was quarantined for life, spent the rest of her life in quarantine, despite really doing anything illegal or wrong, you know. Today, that story would have ended differently, as would have Carl's.
Yes.
It's interesting, both of them, you know, did things were either distasteful, illegal, or, you know, just absolutely gross. Neither one of them felt they were responsible for anything. They didn't do anything wrong.
Yes.
Carl didn't feel he did anything wrong.
Right.
Neither did Mary Mallon.
I find interesting the whole process of what a composer does, and because you have a date where you know that you have to have this finished by this, but you're constantly making revisions.
What date is that?
Tomorrow. No, but but you'll also, because you're there through the process of the staging, because Carlisle Floyd used to do the same thing. He would make changes during the process of the rehearsals. And I noticed, because you've been coming to our auditions for the casting, that you'll say, well, I like this character, but maybe I'll change some notes or change the keys for some of this person's music to make it work for them. So.
Well, we did that presentation for the board, where some of the actors, singers who are in the production sang for the board to preview, you know, this new opera that they had never heard before. So I had the luxury of hearing them sing what I had written and realize, okay, this needs to go up a third. You know, it's just too low for them, and so I made those adjustments. And there may be others like that. Aside from, you know, when it gets staged, we may need more time to get that set out there, or for that
Add
person
some
to
bars,
enter.
yes.
So there'll be those kind of adjustments as well.
Sure. But what's really nice as a stage director, I've done a lot of stage directing for composers who are no longer with us, and so I have to sort of guess at what they would have wanted or what they felt about a certain, you know, I have questions. What does this mean? Why did he put this here? But I can just ask Tom, like,
Right, exactly.
what is this about? What did you mean? You know, what was your intention? And I feel great about being able to exact your vision as you see it. You know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to work with you.
It's really exciting.
You know, this is unrelated. Cut it out if you want. When I was young, I had a performance by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and that's pretty exciting. It was 1980, before you were born.
Yeah, right.
And so.
Notice he says that to her, not to me.
They had the same kind of introduction you just gave. You know, the Henry Mazer was the conductor, and this was for a children's concert. The pieces were performed for a series of children's. Anyway, so he says to the audience, he goes, "Boys and girls, you think most composers are dead, but we have a real live one here today." and then I had to walk down the aisle and go, "Hi." You know.
That's great.
So hopefully I'll still be alive by this fall, so I can do the same thing.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's a great pleasure. It's been a pleasure working with you, even for years back on the individual pieces you let us use for the Witching Hour.
It's such a joy to see you work, to hear you play and conduct my music. You're an artiste. Absolutely. I'm lucky.
Thank you. We're lucky.